Muki Yeung, take two.
Yes.
Hey, Muki, thanks for doing this. This is going to be a lot of fun. I'm really excited about talking to you.
No worries. Always good to chat.
Yeah, it's the morning in Sydney. You live in Sydney now. You are born and raised in Sydney, but you spent some time on a coffee farm in Brazil. And you and I met. We met at the Sydney event, coming up to the Sydney event last year, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Think so.
I think you were about to head to Origin or something as that happened, and you weren't able to speak on one of the panels that we were going to have. But
Yeah, that's right.
remember, yeah. So
Yeah.
we met beforehand, and then we met after you came back from Origin.
Yes. Yeah. I remember now.
And we had some great chats as well at the panel event. That was where I met Ollie, actually.
Was that the PCP chat?
Yes. That was a really interesting conversation. And you and I had a few conversations while I was in Australia, and I thought I really want to talk to Muki about especially the fact that you've spent time living at Origin. You don't just travel to Origin, but you spent a couple of years living at Origin.
Yeah. So I had the amazing opportunity of being able to live in Brazil. Part of my time was spent with a coffee exporter, and the rest of my time I spent living on a beautiful estate.
Yeah.
So California Coffee Estates, which is owned and managed by Louise and Flavia Saldana. They're two of my dearest friends, and I do miss it. I was actually just thinking about it yesterday.
You're getting itchy for another trip?
Oh, yes. And it's good timing too. I think harvest is coming up, so maybe in a couple of months, fingers crossed. Yeah.
So
time to visit again.
For those of us who haven't been to Origin, let alone lived at Origin, what was the difference for you, and what continues to be the difference for you between traveling to Origin and actually living at Origin for a couple of years?
So an important thing that I think everyone should remember is if you're traveling to Origin as a buyer, they're there to try to show you the best of what they can offer, of what things are. So they will be running around, people cleaning things up. They want to portray everything in the best possible light. And unfortunately, I feel like that also hides some of the difficulties of Origin. People sometimes go and they have that experience and go, oh, nothing's wrong. Everyone looks happy and well fed, and but they don't see the difficulties, the stresses sometimes. And when you're there long term, you start to see all those little intricacies, what's the word?
The challenges?
All the challenges that they don't present to you if you're only there for 1 or 2 weeks.
It's interesting you say that. I had a farmer invite me to come to their farm. I'm not going to say what country this is. And I couldn't make it for this harvest.
Mm-hmm.
And when somebody else that I know went, they started telling me about how they couldn't go anywhere without security guards. And there were certain, literally, like, you don't go off certain paths on the coffee farm because of cartels being around, of a whole bunch of shit that they just don't want you. Well, they themselves don't go down there because they don't want to see it, and they don't want people who are going to get on Instagram and start talking about that shit. That wasn't something that I was actually privy to. And I mean, I know that there's some dark shit that goes on at Origin, and we've had lots of people talk about them, including Ollie on this podcast. But what are the kinds of things? I have loads of family in Brazil. I can't wait to head to Brazil and get there. But what are some of the kinds of things that you have seen at Origin that kind of made you think this is a little more challenging than they're letting on?
Well, Brazil's lucky in the sense that it's basically a first world country. So I never felt like I was in danger, and we don't need security in Brazil.
Oh, that must be nice.
Yes, it's in many ways it's such a lucky country, and I was very lucky to go to be in Brazil. I never felt like I was ever in danger. But I guess the sort of thing that I experienced there would just be, I guess a simple one would be roads.
The roads are not well built.
Yeah.
Okay.
Infrastructure. When you go visit a lot of, and you'll have this experience visiting smaller farmers in many other origins, but just little things that over time you realize you start to take for granted, like paved roads, for one, clean water still in many places. Yeah.
What are the water sources like in Brazil? Is it city water that they usually use for farming? Is it irrigation off their own farms that they're using?
Depending on the location. So there is plumbing in many places. Some places they need to build water tanks. Brazil has a lot of natural spring water everywhere. Many farmers and communities, if they're lucky, they can tap that, and that's available for the community or the farm to use instead. Otherwise, it'll be tank water, rainwater, delivered water. Where I was, we're lucky enough that it's a wetter region, so we didn't have too much drought. But I know parts of Brazil, particularly this time of, from around December through to January, they suffered through one of the worst droughts that they've had in a long time.
That seems to be going around at the moment.
Yeah,
I laugh
funny
because it's not funny at all.
Yeah,
it's I laugh because we're going through times here where there's so many climate deniers, climate change deniers, and there seems to be some shit going on. Anyway,
yes,
is it serious enough in Brazil that it's going to change coffee farming?
I think Brazil, depending on the region, they're lucky that people in the past have looked at Brazilian quality saying it's lower quality or it's lower altitude, they can't produce quality. But I think with where the climate is going, it's actually going to be better for Brazil. They might actually get more out of it than, say, Central America, where it's going to be so hot.
Yep.
So for Brazil, it could be opportunity, but we'll have to see, because some regions are already in Brazil itself are already suffering with the lack of rain, the intense heat. Coffee plants just can't survive at that kind of climate range.
Is the work that World Coffee Research is doing? We had Greg Menahan on the podcast. Is the work that they're doing directly helping Brazilian farmers with understanding what kind of varietals will work best for them?
Not WCR. Brazil has a lot of coffee academics.
Okay.
They have some amazing universities, researchers, research institutes based within Brazil. Two of them in particular have some of the most impressive gene banks for coffee, and they do develop their own varietals.
What does a gene bank look like?
A gene bank is just a collection of many different coffee varietals, and the geneticists will use that collection to breed new varietals.
Hybrids.
Yes.
Wow.
And it's fascinating too. There's one in particular that I spent a lot of time at. It's called IAPAR. It's if the translation is like Agronomical Institute of Paraná.
Do you speak Portuguese?
A little.
Okay.
I studied it before I went, but as soon as I got there, imagine, it's just such a big country.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And when I thought that I knew how to speak it and had enough to get away with, I would travel somewhere and they would speak it in a completely different way. the
Dialect's a bitch.
The dialect, the slang. So, and they speak it so quickly. I could never keep up. So my Portuguese is good enough that I could understand what they were saying, respond back a little bit, but yeah, it could be better.
Do you speak Spanish? I'm assuming you travel to Origin quite a bit.
Not anymore. Hopefully they'll pick up, because Brazil was such a focus for me. Spanish, that's actually the next one I want to pick up.
Good luck with that. They speak so fast. I've been trying to learn here because I live in California, and 90% of the people that live here speak Spanish, and I just can't pick it up as well as I.
It's just the speed that they speak it in.
Oh yeah,
I'm sure you're familiar with it. When someone speaks to me in Portuguese or Spanish, it's like your head is slowly trying to translate it.
Oh yeah.
But you're trying to translate the words and then swap them in the way that they're speaking it. So like you're going, okay, that word is dog and that word is water. Yeah. And then I got to swap them around, and that's the sentence. And by the time that you actually get it together, they're off on another tangent, and you're still there trying to figure out, is that dog or is it horse?
Yeah, it's one of those things that they say that you shouldn't consider yourself fluent in a language until you're thinking in that language.
Yes. Yeah.
So the only one I can claim is English and Arabic. Other than that, I'm just pretending no matter what I say. So let's talk a little bit more about Brazil and the water. That's something that really interests me. We found out so the harvest that passed last year in Ethiopia, and I think we've talked about this a little bit on the podcast before. I was getting sent a ton of gujis from different people, and I kept telling everybody, even the people who I know roast really well, I kept telling them there's something wrong with this coffee. But because gujis are just so beautiful usually, so that when they're not, it's so obvious. And I started to see a pattern of how everyone's gujis weren't working. Christopher Ferran let me know when he was in the Guji region just a couple of months ago, last month maybe. What had happened was last year they had a drought, so they were needing to recycle the water that they were using during processing down the line with the rest of, well, not recycle it down the line, they'd recycle it with every lot.
Yeah.
And so when they have droughts in Brazil, do they approach it the same way?
Brazil, they're one of the largest producers of natural coffee, if not, I think first or second largest producer of natural coffees.
Right?
Yes.
There's Vietnam, there's them, and there's Colombia, right?
Top producers of coffee, yes.
Natural.
Top producer, one of the top producers of natural coffees, just because you don't need technology or access to power or water to produce naturals. Though in many zones they're recommending particularly smaller farmers to produce what we call pulp natural coffees, which requires water and a pulper. A pulp natural coffee is essentially a honey. It's just a different word for it. The process is very, very similar. So you'll run the coffee through a pulper with water, and they'll remove that outer layer of fruit, and then you'll dry the coffee. It's quite common in Brazil also for, say, if it's a larger farm, they might try to depulp, will remove that extra mucilage by running it through another kind of depulper. So instead of having that fermentation period in washing, try to remove that really quickly.
Okay.
Just for like the clean coffee, they can dry and process very quickly.
So they depulp it and then they put it out to dry?
Yes. So if for a standard pulp natural, it'll just be removing that outer fruit.
Yep. And leave the mucilage.
Yeah, leaving the mucilage and washing that again and drying it. Yeah.
Do they call that step so if they were to remove the whole of the mucilage, is that the demucilagination?
Yes. Yes.
Do you know how long it took me to learn how to say that word? Thank you. Shout out to Lucia Solis for that.
Yeah.
I practiced saying that word so many times with her before the podcast episode started. It was just didn't make sense. It was difficult for me to say, but demucilagination. So you forgo the demucilagination stage, and
it depends on the farmer, depends on what process they want to go through. A lot of smaller farmers in many small areas, they don't, particularly in Brazil where fermentation isn't particularly commonplace, they would just put that out to dry after pulping. And it does help increase the quality because of all the processes involved having to pulp coffee. For a larger farm, which is trying to, like, imagine a really, really big estate wanting to
give us some context. Like, what does really, really big mean? How many really big containers a year are they harvesting and producing?
They could probably produce 50 or more containers. So if a container is 320 bags, or about 20 metric tons of coffee, a really big estate is producing 50, sometimes more. So
every small estate,
potentially, yes. So every a small estate here, if I'm saying estate, is probably going to can be 50 to 100 hectares.
When you say here, are you talking about Australia?
Oh, sorry,
or are you talking about Brazil?
Not Australia, Brazil.
I'm like, I'm sure we don't have any in Sydney yet.
So a small estate would be anywhere between 50 to maybe 200, 300. Like 300-ish, 300 up to maybe 400, you'll call a medium estate.
Bags?
And then hectares.
Hectares.
Size-wise. And then a very large estate, and I know there's some in Brazil that can be more than 1,000 hectares plus.
Wow.
So they're just massive. They most typically in the Cerrado region of Brazil, in Minas Gerais, where you have several of these massive estates right next to each other. And if you compare that to what we would call a sitio or I've forgotten the local term for it now. Is it chácara? Yeah, it basically means like a tiny farm or a plot.
Okay.
Which can be a hectare, maybe
like a micro
10 at most. Yeah. So these are actually small producers that only have a tiny plot of land. And if you compare what a small community or a small producer can do versus a large producer trying to harvest and process coffees from 1,000 hectares of coffee. So a small producer, they've got a smaller lot, they can harvest together, they've got less coffee to work with, they can probably spend a bit more time processing that. But I've seen on big estates too, you are under the pump of nature to pick and process this coffee as soon as possible. So you do see that difference in technology. They're just trying to process it as soon as possible. So removing that mucilage by mechanical means sometimes is the best option for them to just process that coffee, dry it as soon as possible. Whereas for a smaller farmer or a smaller community, they can take that time to produce flavors and quality as well. Not to say that a large farm can't do it. I've seen on a lot of big farms now because they can afford the consultation, the infrastructure, and they have that knowledge. I see a lot of big farms producing specialty, but it's on the side. It's like a side project. So they might do a small portion of that whether that's some of this new fermentation, really interesting fermented naturals. But the bulk of their crop is usually something
Commodity.
to blend. Yep.
So can we drill down into this idea that they're working against nature? Well, not against nature, but they're up against nature in being under the pump with regards to this. Now, on Instagram the other day, I saw a video of a farm in Brazil that the farmer had got this new toy, big toy, and basically what they were doing is putting the cherries in, and it was separating them out by color grading them into ripe and still green. And the volume of green was astronomical.
Yes.
And so one has to assume that just from sheer volume that they are, that the mechanical means under which they're farming is they're happy to compromise the waste to get things happening quicker. Am I right in that?
Well, labor in Brazil is incredibly expensive. They do have the technology available to mechanically harvest, and the way that the farms are set out in Brazil, they can mechanically harvest. So when you see farms in Brazil, they're usually on much flatter territory, and when they plant coffee, they've taken mechanical harvesting into consideration. So they're growing coffee in plots, so you can drive a mechanical harvester through it. I actually like the idea of mechanical harvesting because coffee picking, if you've ever done it, is a bitch. Like, no one should do it.
Yeah,
it sucks balls. If there is anything that we can do to make it faster, make it easier, make it better, we should be welcoming that and sharing it and teaching. Let's
focus on that for a second, if you don't mind. Because I can hear people out there now saying these are jobs that very low income families in a lot of third world countries, this is the only kind of jobs that they can get. This is their profession. Even though it's horrible, it's still I'm not saying it's horrible, it's difficult. Do we want to take those jobs away from them?
I don't think you're taking jobs away from anyone. You're providing someone, you're skilling someone up to do something better. And I think if you become more efficient, you could actually be paid more. So if you look at it in that light.
Which is not really a reality for a lot of people, because their access to education, their access to other jobs, we're not talking about countries like the States or Australia or Brazil or whatnot. We're talking about in other countries, that's not going to be plausible for them. There are also countries that will afford mechanical harvest methods right now.
But if you look at knowing Central, many parts of Central, you could never have one of these large mechanical harvesters. The best, if people can afford it even, would probably be, I don't know if you've ever seen them, but they're used for harvesting olives. It's like a big rake.
Okay. Oh, and it shakes the tree?
Yeah. So it's handheld, and you kind of comb it through the tree, and it'll shake off ripe cherries. So I don't know if it will ever happen, but I do know that there's, even nowadays, there are a shortage of pickers. Not only in Brazil, there's a massive shortage of pickers. I know in Central there's a shortage of pickers as well. So just being able to innovate that part, make it easier for people. A lot of the time, these people are being paid per kilo or by weight. So I think it just makes sense to...
I agree with you. Look, from an agricultural perspective, we're experiencing a shortage of pickers here in the US because they're stopping immigration here. Well, they're doing everything they can to stop immigration. And local Americans don't want to pick fruit, and
No.
because of that, and people are scared because of the darker problems that are happening here, so they don't want to show up to work even if they are pickers. So the farmers are, a lot of the avocado farmers are just leaving the avocados on the trees, and all the other fruits on the trees, because pickers are too scared that if they turn up to work, they're going to have ICE. That's the people who, the immigration police, for lack of a better term. They're really concerned that ICE is going to turn up and arrest them and deport them. So I feel like picking's becoming one of those things internationally that's becoming a problem because of the shortage, and it's going to cause agriculture to become more mechanized. But I'm not sure how you mechanize it in third world countries where the farmers can't afford to.
Yeah, it's going to be a slow change, and that's where I see, like, I'm very much about, it's not about what you use or what you do, it's how. So whether that's mechanical harvesting or drying or using different kind of fermentations, I see we're really lacking in that innovation side at origin. I think people are a little bit fixated on this romantic view of origin having to be a certain way without really experiencing the difficulties. When you understand the risk involved as a coffee farmer, the work involved, you would want them to do these things if they could have it. So I spent some time with this small community in particular in Matao, Tomazina, and you see them work so hard throughout the year, but you don't know what nature will do. So no matter how difficult they work and careful they are, all that money that they've spent on fertilizing or pruning or this or that, or their own infrastructure, their own raised beds, all those materials, and then you have a change in the weather and it doesn't rain, or it rains after they've harvested and they're having trouble drying coffee. A lot of this people don't take into consideration at all. Like that's what they have to go through, that kind of risk, and they can lose that crop, or their quality reduces. So where then are they going to get the money for next year?
Or to feed their families this year.
Yep. So that concept of risk, I think it's something that we're not pretty familiar with at all over here.
I don't think that enough people care about it. It's not that we're not familiar with it. It's that people aren't asking and probing the questions. They don't want to see it. I mean, it's not a difficult concept to grasp, is it?
No, most people know that it's difficult. Like they have this broad idea of, oh yeah, it must be really difficult being a coffee farmer. But you got to be there. You have to see it.
So let's talk about some of the challenges, because that's the point of this podcast, is like to unpack some of this shit so that people can get a real insight into what it's like for somebody like you who gets sent over there by a company that you're working for to learn and grow and get real insight into what's going on. So what are some of the challenges? What are some of the risks?
Okay. I'm going to hopefully he'll be okay with this, but my dear friend Louise, as an example, he has a medium-sized estate. He produces some amazing coffees out of Brazil. I'm probably a little bit biased, but I would say some of the best. It's such a beautiful farm. I love his family. His wife Flavia and him met in university. They're both agronomists by trade. An agronomist is an agricultural engineer. I would liken it to, you're like a doctor for farming. Yeah, basically. They have 2 beautiful daughters. So this is an estate that employs about 100 people. Louise doesn't just grow coffee. He grows soy and corn. he doesn't make money from coffee.
Does he subsidize his revenue for coffee with soy and corn?
Yes. But
That's
all
starting to happen a lot.
three, they have to.
Mm.
Coffee, I often have this conversation with him where it makes almost no sense sometimes for him to grow coffee because it just costs so much money.
We're hearing that from every farmer and green buyer that comes on this show. The number of them that are saying it is making less and less sense to grow coffee.
It really makes no sense. It makes no sense to grow coffee compared to the price of soy and corn. If you do it well and nature is rewarding you, yeah, then it makes no sense at all. But I know this past year, it's not just coffee that's suffering. It's many other kinds of crops as well. Louise hasn't had a good year for his corn or his soy.
I'm sorry.
And I think a lot of people look at someone like him who comes from this big estate, and I know they think, oh, you have this big coffee estate. You must be so wealthy. You use all this innovation and technology. You guys must have money. But I see Louise, and this man doesn't sleep.
Yeah. But
Every
this is the same with every business, Muki.
the weather changes, every time the weather changes, every time, like, he was over here for mice recently, and half the time, if I'm peering over his shoulder, he's checking out what the weather's like back in Brazil. But this is a guy who's responsible for. He sees it as this. He's responsible for 100 people, the livelihoods of 100 people who are relying on him for work and to be fed. He doesn't want to let people go, if possible. And he wants opportunities for his wife and daughters to live a comfortable life. And that all that stress is resting on his shoulders. And I think people don't see that. And I know it's not just him, it's many, many coffee farmers as well. It's
not
many
just
other kinds of businesses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's something that I'm talking a lot about in this new podcast that we've got coming out alongside this particular podcast. It's a 10-minute kind of musings and ponderings from me every day, a 10-minute podcast called the Daily Coffee Pro. And it's talking about this kind of thing. You know, it's trying to get employees to get insight into how fucking stressful it is to own a business and to have paying your wage a part of the stress that I carry every single day, because I never want to put you out of a job.
I think there's a big part of the coffee industry that don't recognize coffee as a business. Coffee is a very romantic thing, but we have to see it is a business at the end of the day. People do need to make money. And if we look at it more in that light, maybe it'll change.
Even.
Yeah.
Muki, like a lot of the time, it's not even about just making money. It's about just surviving. I have a seasonal product. This is seasonal elixir. You know, so for me, at the beginning of winter, I know that we're going to hit some hard times. And I have to consider that when I am hiring any time of the year. And it sucks. It's so fucking stressful to make sure that we have enough cash flow to make sure that everyone's getting paid and taxes are paid and insurance is paid and all that kind of stuff is paid, when we know that if there's a hard winter that hits, and there was a really hard winter that hit this year in the US, we're going to sell almost no elixir. And that's a kind of stress that as a you never want to lay anybody off, because summer's going to come around and you want you want that skill to stay within the business. So we have to try and figure out how to make our business season proof. And we're in the process of doing that now. But it's every single business that's out there. I get contacted by business owners all the time saying, is there something wrong with me? Why the fuck can't I make ends meet? I'm like, look, everyone is experiencing it right now.
Yeah, it's tougher and tougher. And I think it's particularly in coffee, it's so hard because people undervalue the product so severely.
And employees undervalue having a job and the value that they bring to the success of a business, because for good reason. Here they're getting paid minimum wage. And so to them, they don't feel valued. So therefore they don't bring their A game, and you get a chicken and an egg scenario, right? It's for anyone who's listening, check out episode 7 of the Coffee Pro. I've suggested an answer to it in that. That hopefully will turn everything around for baristas and cafe owners and roasters and the owners of roasting brands. It's about conspiring to each other's success, and how to ask for a pay rise where the business is winning from you getting a pay rise. So, but it's a whole cultural shift, Muki, both at the front end of the supply chain and the back end of the supply chain. And something that you just said then that was so important. Coffee is such an undervalued commodity.
It is, incredibly. So what was it? I can't remember what it was in. It was either in the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times. Someone had covered briefly on the recent Australian Barista Championships here. And unfortunately, the way it was written, without context, the average consumer who read this had no idea that it was for an elite level competition, that it's very rare that you ever be served coffee of this caliber, and they don't understand how much time and effort genuinely went into producing these kinds of qualities, let alone preparing them for a competition. And the kind of comments, every time I read one of those, I'll finish it, get to the comments, and I'm like, I know this is really going to piss me off. Should I read them? All right, I'll take a look. And it's always the same. People get so offended if you do anything different to what they know for coffee. How dare you charge more than $5 for something that I can have every day? Like, how
you don't want to get me started on this, girl. Trust me.
But it's so I think about this a lot. Like you know what bubble tea is? The bubble tea trend.
The bubble tea, yeah.
Like, I like bubble tea.
It's here even. I'm just shocked by it.
But I'll go have a cup, and it always pisses me off a little bit when I go have it. Like, I'll enjoy it, but I'm handing over $6, and I always think, fuck, if every person could just pay $6 for a cup of coffee, that would change the world. That would really change coffee. If the average consumer could drop money on coffee the way they drop money on bubble tea, or even a beer, or even a beer, it would change coffee so much. What is it?
We've got so much
coffee
to do. And I was go ahead. What is it about coffee that stops people from doing that? Is that what you were about to say?
Yes.
You know what it is? It's a Mark Dundon calls it the race to the bottom.
Yes.
And we are a consequence of our own actions as an industry. And I was speaking with Kieran Westlake about this on the podcast. I would love to see someone like ASCA or FCA put out a video that really does focus on marketing to the consumer of what we serve, to help them, educate them on what we're doing.
Well, I reckon we could be more hardline than that. I think if tomorrow, if everyone decided to set a minimum cost for coffee, if we all had the balls to set a minimum cost for coffee, everyone, how much would that change the industry?
I agree with you, and we spoke about
but I know
it's impossible. But it's price fixing. It's for so many reasons. Someone said in the Cafe Owners Day in Sydney, like, why can't we all just decide that we're going to set the price for coffee at $6 and that's it? That's the base price, and anything people want more than that, is just going to be extra, 50 cents extra for decaf, 50 cents extra for soy, but the base minimum everyone's going to charge is $6. And the problem is that both in Australia and here, I know that that's price fixing and it's collusion. And so you can't do it. All of those business owners will go to jail.
Yeah, that's where I say you need someone to champion it as a change, similar to what we have for alcoholic beverages, where you are setting a price minimum. It almost, unfortunately, I don't like the term for it, but it almost needs to be some kind of coffee tax if you want things to improve for the better. Though I think it'll never happen.
It won't happen because that tax is going to not end up in the place that it needs to end up, which is in another country, in the hands of the growers. What we need to do, and look, we're experiencing this at both ends of the supply chain. We broke down the cost of a cup of coffee in Sydney, in Australia, and it turns out that these numbers are not. We didn't create these numbers. These numbers were released by a government organization that worked off average prices that they received over a scope of 2,500 businesses. The average amount of profit that was being made on a cup of coffee was 17 cents.
Yeah.
Right? 17 cents. That's at paying $29 per kilo. That's for an 8-ounce latte, I believe. So that's using cow, and it's using coffee that's around the $29 a kilo mark. Now, if we're making 17 cents a kilo, 17 cents a cup off that, the people that are serving that coffee are experiencing the same kinds of pain points that the people that are producing the coffee are experiencing. We need to be paying more for cups of coffee so that the businesses can be paying their staff a fair wage, and so that they can be less enticed to be buying commodity coffee where farmers are being underpaid for it. You know, it starts so that we can help the front end of the supply chain continue the business practices that they want in order to support the back end of the supply chain, in my humble opinion. And the only way that we can change that is if we start getting people who are consuming the product to understand the pain points at both the front and the back end of the supply chain. Because we had Alek Robeshkevich on the podcast. He's from Nestle. Not last week, the week before. And he was telling us some numbers of what, like, the volume of Nescafe and Nespresso that's consumed. And it's 6,000 cups per second.
Yeah.
Now, when you're looking at that kind of volume and you're looking at how cheap it is to access that kind of coffee, compared to a $6 a cup coffee, people who are experiencing difficult financial times are always going to default to something that's going to be more cost effective for them than supporting a local business.
Yeah. This is where I say I think there's a bit of a gap missing in the specialty market, particularly here, where, like, I think Nespresso have done a really great job at putting specialty grade coffee in people's homes. Like Nespresso, I don't have one myself. I'll rather just make the coffee myself. But
I'm extremely happy to hear that, Muki.
What, that I make coffee myself? Or?
Correct. Or that you're not doing the Nespresso thing and like in Keurig. It's not.
But
Nespresso,
I see that
it's the pods. I'm not a fan of the pods and the carbon footprint associated with them.
I'm not a huge fan of the carbon footprint either. I think there's definitely innovations that can be made there. But I'll give you an example there. So my mum, she's a Nestle Gold drinker. Nescafe.
Nescafe Gold.
Nescafe Gold. Can't
I
get her off
became
it.
very well accustomed with Nescafe Gold when I was at university.
Yeah. So that is the smell I'm familiar with. Like, it's super nostalgic. She loves it. I've tried throughout my coffee career to get her on every brewer known to man. Like, when I first started in coffee and I was super excited, I got her an AeroPress or something like that, with a bag of roasted beans, and said, it's so easy. You can make a really good coffee at home. And then I'll visit again about 6 months later. I'm digging around her pantry and I find that bag of coffee. And she's, Nescafe Gold still out on the counter. Many, many years later, all the iterations that we went through, whether that was like a mocha pot, which she used for a while, a couple of different kind of brewers. I think the one that she uses most now is a plunger. So
Okay.
Elisa got her on a French press. But the best way of getting her to drink specialty coffee on a consistent basis was a pod machine.
Yeah, that's a problem.
But I see it as, if you want people to be able to drink specialty coffee, to pay if we can't get them at that $4, $5 mark, $6 mark at a cafe, I still don't want them to be buying that $1 cup from 7-Eleven. If there's that middle ground that they can spend, whether it's on pods that's of high quality that they're buying from a local roastery, or something equivalent of that, an Australian company, anything like that, at the very least, we're taking a step in the right direction, because that money is for specialty coffee, right?
Yeah. So and I'm asking this question as a devil's advocate here. What's your problem with the $1 7-Eleven coffee?
Because for you to save money on that coffee, someone else is paying for it.
And by someone else, you mean the farmer. They're the ones that are getting...
Yeah. You're not... It's just not sustainable. That kind of coffee is not sustainable. And
the issue there is, I as a consumer, if I don't have... This is not me, I mean the general consumer. The general consumer is going to say, it's not my fucking problem.
Yes. And you're setting a dangerous precedent there, as that all coffee then should be $1. You're creating that idea that the value should be less. And unfortunately, as soon as 7-Eleven started that $1 cup, look at how many other companies have tried to take that on as well.
And I haven't been in Australia. It happened when I moved out of Australia. And is it just a brewed coffee, or is it like a latte, or?
It's a milk coffee that comes from an automated machine.
Okay. So they're buying shit coffee. They use no people to prepare it. And it's a press a button, and who knows what kind of milk you're getting with that. It could be reconstituted powdered milk. Is that right?
I'm not sure at all what the setup of that would be. Yeah.
So people are not, I mean, it's quite genius when you think about it, because people are saying, I'm going to spend $1 and I don't expect really great coffee because I know I'm only paying $1. But it's going to give me my caffeine fix.
Yeah. But I think for a good chunk of people, they're also going to look at it as, because spend $1 that I used to spend $3 for. It's not quite as good as $3, but it's only $1.
It's good enough.
Yeah. So then why would I ever want to spend $3?
It's the same as I used to get people come in and when I was on bar and say, your coffee is not strong enough. And I've only ever worked in specialty coffee. And so and it used to happen a lot at the place that I was working at last. So we're going back about 4 years ago now, and it was one of the best specialty shops in Sydney. And you'd get people come in, usually the older wogs, they'd come in and they'd be like, so your coffee's not strong enough. And my go-to question is, what coffee do you normally drink?
Yeah.
And it will typically be some version of a Robusta roaster. And what you come to realize is that they've associated good with strong and shit. You know, and it's one of the really old school roasters that none of us would typically drink in our profession, but they have become accustomed because it's what they drink. It is their standard of good.
Yeah.
And to them, what we're serving is weak, unsophisticated coffee that offends their sensibility because we're charging, in their mind, so much for it, and it's not even good.
Yeah.
And this is where I really think that the only way we're going to navigate these waters is with education or some sort of media campaign where we talk about a bunch of different things. There's not going to be one way of fixing this.
I guess that's the unfortunate thing is when you see coffee media portrays coffee, obviously, in the more balanced, correct light. But every time you read about coffee in mainstream media, there's always that bit of attitude of, oh, these guys are Ponzi. Isn't it humorous that they're taking coffee this seriously?
Not just that. I saw an article the other day where was it the LA Times, perhaps? The LA Times was here's 7 ways that you can get that you don't have to pay full price for your coffee. And they were doing things like, if you want an iced latte, order an espresso over ice, and then just go to the condiments bar and fill it with milk. And you're only paying for an espresso. You're not paying
how to game the system.
Exactly. Yeah. It's that kind of thing. It's like, let's show these coffee elitists that we could fuck them over by showing them how we can game the system. And it's like, okay, we're doing something wrong.
If you look at it like that, the average consumer, when they talk about specialty coffee, they're not thinking, the first thing that comes into their head is not a farmer, is not how you pick or process coffee and all the work that goes into it. Unfortunately, the first thing they see is, oh, it's a hipster barista and I don't want to give them money. That's unfortunate.
But it's a reality. It's a reality we need to navigate, because it's quite honestly, it's not just, we have a lot to do to fix the back end of the supply chain, and we've got a lot of work to do with regards to alerting people who are consumers of this agricultural product how we can fix it. That it needs fixing in the first place. But on the other side of things, the price of coffee hasn't shifted in 30 years. No. The price of a cup of coffee, not the it's
crazy. In the time that I've been working in coffee, the average price has been about $3.50.
Right, and it's not 30 years; it's more like 10 years. Sorry, but the price of it hasn't changed in 10 years, and that's a real problem, because rent has gone up, wages have gone up, the cost of coffee, of specialty coffee, is going up now because people are choosing to pay more for their coffee or charge more for roasted coffee. It's now starting to get cool to do that, but is that flowing on to the back end of the supply chain, or are they just saying, oh, here we go, here's a transparency report, it means fucking nothing, and I can charge you more for it because I've listed that I spent $3 a pound on the coffee that I bought, and it gives me full reason to charge you $15 or $20 for that pound because I paid more.
Yeah.
You didn't pay $15 more for that pound. You were paying $1.50 or $2, and now you're paying an extra $1. I don't understand why you increased the cost of it $5. This is where people start to get really confused about that side of things. Like I'm getting some people on the podcast to talk about this. I want to understand. I'm a massive fan of this transparency movement, but I want to see it done well.
Yeah.
And I don't know that it is being done well or that it's meaningful yet, because from what I understand, we have to collect all the data points before we can actually start presenting a transparency report that is meaningful.
Yeah. I think there's a lot on education also for people to understand on that end, the supply chain and all the people involved in the supply chain and where a lot of that money goes to.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we frequently talk about the farmer and the buyer. You sort of miss everyone in between, and those people in between are incredibly integral to getting coffee from A to B.
I feel like that's the vacuum where the money's disappearing into. Am I incorrect?
It is, but if you didn't have those people and you weren't paying them for their service,
it wouldn't move around the world.
It wouldn't move. So if we recognize what these people do, their value as well, and break that down, I think it's really important. So I'm just going to break this down a little bit.
Yeah,
if we go from tree to, say, to a roaster.
Mm-hmm.
So at the farm level, you have, depending on the kind of farm, you've got the farmer. If we start from the tree, you might have your picker, the people who work on the farm that tend to the trees as well. So there might be farm hands who they fertilize the trees, they prune the trees. Then you have your the farm staff who process the coffee, and a lot of the time these are different staff because they specialize in different fields. So you might have staff who just specifically there to manage your processing, your drying, your milling.
Are these typically full-time employees, or are they people who they bring in during harvest?
If I say it from a Brazil perspective, let's just say Louise's farm, these are full-time employees. So if they're not doing this during the coffee season, they might be working on another crop. Okay. But so even on a farm level, you've gone through a dozen, maybe 24 different hands doing different things. After it's dry milled, it might need to be bagged. It might need to be sorted on the farm, hand sorted on the farm, cut on the farm. So it might go through 2 or 3 quality lab people on the farm before they even offer it to an exporter. So on the farm end, they can gauge, okay, I know the quality is going to be this, so I'll be offered X price. Then they'll go to an exporter who then it goes through several rounds of the quality control team there, 3 or 4 people. They'll cup it 3 or 4 times initially. You have at that point, you might have a purchasing manager involved, you have logistics involved. That coffee then might need to be moved from the farm to a warehouse that the exporter works with. The coffee then has to be screened and graded again. That's several other people involved. It has to be removed from the bags that they were shipped into the warehouse to be rebagged in branded bags or blended into a different product. And then from that point, it needs to be checked a few times before it goes out to a ship. Then you have the full logistics team there moving the coffee onto a ship, booking a ship in the first place, getting it checked for quarantine purposes, phytosanitary purposes, insurance purposes. That gets onto a boat. It's going to take 45 to 60 days to get to Australia, lands in Australia. Your warehouse team, your logistics team then takes it from there. You have several people involved checking again, cross-checking against leaving that country, the insurance, the quality, quarantine. There's a government entity called AQUIS that comes and checks the coffee in case for any biohazards and organic hazards that might enter Australia. That's stuck there for about a week or two, and that gets moved into a warehouse. That's packed, unpacked, repalletized, stored away somewhere. And then someone on our end, say from the importer side, they might call up a customer and say, hey, your coffee's arrived. The customer puts in an order, and then you've got a several man team that has to get that order together, sticks it on a truck, and then gets it to your door. Like, not even counting how many people involved in all those processes, but that's a lot of people.
It's
dozens
of
and
people.
dozens. And I think people, that's a really, really, really quick breakdown of sort of what coffee goes through to move, but they're all integral. They're all really, really integral in that supply chain. You could not move coffee without these people.
How many people in our industry do you think, what percentage of our industry do you think actually get this?
Very little. Very little. Like, I'm going to be really frank. I do work for a coffee importer, and I feel like a lot of the time we get the brunt of people have a bad opinion that coffee importers are the part in the supply chain that take all the money, but they don't understand that the process of moving coffee is so convoluted, so complex. You do need to pay that in between. I'm not talking just about the importer. You're paying for the insurance, the exporter, the logistics, the warehousing. That's all. That is not free.
So help me understand
for
something.
Service.
And this is where I've been looking for a straight answer to this for near on a year now, since this podcast started. A farmer produces some coffee.
Yes.
It costs them X dollars. Let's say it's somewhere between $1 and $2.50 a pound to make it, right? Or 80 cents. I hear some numbers like it costs some farmers who are mechanizing coffee, like Brazil, it costs them somewhere in the order of 80 cents a pound. So let's say it costs them somewhere between 80 cents and $2.50 per pound to create a bag of green coffee, a pound of green coffee. Somewhere from there to the cafe who's paying somewhere in the order, if they're paying wholesale, let's say they're paying around about $11 a pound, US. So all of this is US. So somewhere between $9 and $11 a pound, there's a big chunk of money there that I'm trying to understand where the majority of it is going. And I can't figure out who is the biggest winner out of this.
Okay. I think if you look at it this light, let's say that product, these are completely random figures. Let's say that product is $1 a pound, and that the person on the consuming end is paying, the roaster is paying $3, right? That $2 is broken down into tiny increments and split along that supply chain. So the farmer is going to be paid that base price, but everyone in between has to be paid. But it's not like someone's getting the $2. It's split 20 cents here, 10 cents there, 5 cents there. And particularly when you're involving anything that requires some serious finance, it's going to cost a bit of money, particularly something like insurance.
Okay. So if I understand this correctly, the farmer sends the coffee out of the country, gives it to the exporter. The exporter gives it to the importer. The importer then disseminates it to whomever's going to buy it.
Yes.
Right? That's a very simplified version of that. The farmer gets paid when who gets paid?
Now, this is the tricky thing. So a lot of the time we talk about direct trade as being between the buyer and the farmer. But when the buyer can pay, doesn't necessarily tie to when the farmer needs their money.
Okay.
Which is why a lot of the time a farmer, particularly small farmers, and I do see this very often, they prefer to sell to a local broker or an exporter because they get paid immediately.
Right.
So if they offer, with a fluctuating C market and then your FX market, when it hits a time where they feel like they might get their best value, they then will offer it to a broker or an exporter for purchase. And what that exporter or broker is paying is correlated to where that coffee is in terms of quality. So the higher the quality, the more they'll be paid for it, depending on the FX and the C.
What's the FX again?
The foreign exchange.
The foreign exchange.
Yep. And then from that point, generally the exporter won't be paid until we receive documents or depending on how the contract's written, or until the coffee arrives by the importer.
Okay.
And then if you look at it in that light, the importer doesn't get paid generally until after the coffee's delivered.
Yeah.
So there's a massive disparity in that kind of cash flow, because a lot of the time that buyer has good intentions, but you don't have the money to just throw down several tens of thousands. Yeah. And a lot of the time the risk, and we brought this up before, the risk is always on the farmer, unfortunately.
So the farmer has a vested interest based on what their critical need is. If cash flow is their critical need, their vested interest is in selling it as quickly as possible, and oftentimes for a lesser price, because they're going to be carrying less risk. If their cash flow is okay, they're going to tend to be able to hold on.
And I see that a lot of time in Brazil. Smaller producers, they need to sell their coffee as soon as possible.
Right.
Because they need that money for next year's crop. And the way that coffee works generally, as soon as you harvest and as soon as you can sell, that's a period of time when you need those funds to pay for fertilizers, to pay for equipment. It's a really integral time of the coffee production where you need staff to prune the coffee, start to prepare for the year ahead. And if you don't do certain things in that period of time, your output might be less. Then you compare that to a larger estate where they might have another crop to fall back on, whether that's soy or corn or sugarcane or whatever. A lot of the time they'll harvest, they'll put that coffee away because they have their own warehouses, they have their own dry mills, and they'll just wait until conditions look right for them to sell.
Because and by that coffee, sorry, go on.
By that point, it's a bit of a game, because you don't know where things will go. You can only speculate. And we've had farmers that we try to have a good relationship with and really encourage them to sell coffee when we need to buy and sell it ourselves. And particularly some of these big farms, because the owners are highly educated. They're very well connected. They'll go, no, I can hold off. But eventually it hits a point where the coffee's depreciated and the market's gone down and they would have made no money on it.
It's all a game.
Sometimes it is.
So, okay, so we know that the risk is being carried at different loads of the supply chain based on what the needs are of the supply chain at the time.
Yeah.
Right? So if the farmer is getting paid $1 and the importer is selling it for $3, and the roaster is then selling it for $9.
Yeah.
It sounds to me that the roaster is the person who's making the bulk of the money.
I would say yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is my problem here.
Mm-hmm.
We have an increasing number of people who are talking about transparency reports, and I'm going to tell everyone that I'm paying $3.50 for my per pound of specialty coffee. An 85 or an 86, I'm paying $3.50, and that is me paying a fair price to the farmer. And I'm going to go and I'm going to sell that pound of coffee. If I'm selling it wholesale, I'm selling it somewhere around $9. And if I'm selling it retail, I'm selling it somewhere between $16 and $20. I've got no sympathy for these roasters if that's what's going on. And
yeah.
Go on.
No, I think that's that part, which I think we talk about enough. Like, I really see the roaster has no risk. There's very, very little risk. The roaster or the buyer has minimal risk on that end. If we're purely just talking about green coffee, you can purchase a coffee, you can sign a contract with someone. By the time it gets to you, if you don't like it, if you don't think it's up to your spec, you can essentially turn it away and just say, you really can. It's all written on that end. So the risk is all on the farmer and on everyone else down the chain.
Okay, go on. I'll ask you in a second.
So I'll give you this example. I was during MIF, I attended a roasting event, and we had a bit of a back and forth conversation with a couple of roasters. And because I work for an importer, I frequently get people ask me, who sets the price for coffee? Like, where does the money go?
What do they mean by that when they say who sets the price for coffee? Are they specifically talking about the commodity market? Are they specifically talking about individual coffees? What's the question in relation to?
I think they mean the commodity market.
Okay. That's the futures market that sets on demand, right?
The importer is taking all the money. You guys are taking all the money. You're ripping us off because you're paying the farmer X, but you're selling it for this without understanding that in between. And they were asking, like, how can you offer this much to a farmer? How can you work with people who buy this price from farmers? And I threw back at someone that, well, we only buy as cheap as you want us to.
Okay.
That's something people don't consider.
Tell me more about what you mean by that, Muki.
It's importers will only import coffees of a value and quality that a buyer or roaster wants them to.
So what you're saying is if the market's asking for $1 a pound coffees, that's what Condesa Collab's going to sell. That's what you're going to source. If there's no demand for coffees that are costing $5 a pound, then there's no reason for you to make that the majority of your bulk purchase. Is that correct?
Yes. And we see that a lot. Like, we often take the risk on supporting a project. After speaking with Ollie as well, we have quite a number of our team traveling to Origin quite frequently. Like, Harry just got back from Central America.
Shout out to Harry McCauley, you fucking badass.
He's Great Valley, that guy.
Yeah.
Toby and Ollie just got back from Ethiopia. We had Ollie in Kenya about a month or so ago. Toby was in Ethiopia again back in December. Quite a number of our staff travel back and forth from Brazil and other countries. And we get involved in these social projects, and we meet people, and we want to support it, and we want to pay a great price for this coffee. But ultimately, we can't buy that coffee if we can't sell it.
Right.
And a lot of the time we have this amazing coffee that we'll offer a sample to someone. They say, it's just too expensive. Sorry.
That's that race to the bottom that Mark Dundon's talking about. If the coffee's great, that's the secondary consideration.
Like, and people don't see that it makes no sense as business for us to purchase $4-5 a pound coffees if they're just going to sit in our warehouse, depreciate, and we can't sell them.
It's bad business.
Yeah, as much as I would love that we can support all these beautiful projects that we've worked with, you just can't. It makes no sense.
So if we go back to our problem and my thought experiment around trying to understand where the gap is here, that a lot of us aren't able to understand why there's a massive cry for we should be paying the farmer more and we should be charging more for coffees that we're selling in the cafe, there seems to be a hole in here, and it seems to be that the hole where the bulk of the money is being consumed, or the hole that it's going into, actually isn't in the middle of the supply chain. It's actually towards the front end of the supply chain. And please correct me if I'm wrong, because this is not a blame game or anything like that. I'm trying to understand it.
I honestly think that is the case. If you could get the consumer to pay more for coffee, and we're back at that point, it would really change things down the line if the money is being passed down.
But I don't know that would be the case, Muki, because the cafe is is already paying the bulk of the money already. So the money. The reason I want people to pay more money at the front end of the supply chain is so that the cafes have a better chance of surviving. The roaster seems to be the person who's making the bulk of the money in this supply chain. And I see where the problem for me is that the money's staying stuck there.
Yeah. Do you see that in your conversations with people?
Do I see what?
That bulk is with the roaster, the onus is on the roaster.
It's what I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to understand who's making most of the money, because everybody's telling me that they've got these transparency reports that they're putting up, and the reason that they're buying expensive coffees is because they want to be transparent. Well, that doesn't mean fuck all to me if you can't tell me how much money the grower's getting. I don't know how that money's getting disseminated, whether you're paying $3.50 or whether you're paying $15 for a pound of green coffee. I want to understand how that money's getting disseminated down the supply chain. And then I want to understand that if you're then adding somewhere in the order of, let's say, $5 or $6, anywhere up to $10 per pound between you and the front end of the supply chain. So
how do you get to that cost?
Where the fuck is that breakdown?
How does a $10 kilo green coffee turn into $50?
That's it right there.
Yeah.
That's what I understand.
Because as an importer, I know we're selling green coffee to people anywhere between $5 to $25 a kilo.
And for anyone who doesn't understand metrics, so for all the Americans that are listening to, half the numbers that Muki's talking about to get it into pounds, sort of.
Yep.
Around half.
Yep. So how does that turn? So let's say your average blend, your average espresso blend that people are selling, they're probably purchasing anywhere between $8 to $15, probably less. I'm probably closer to $8 to $12 a kilo.
Green?
Yes. How does that suddenly turn into $50?
Or even, I mean, if we talk more of your standard specialty cafe, they're paying around $30 to $40 a kilo. 50's a little. Maybe it's changed since I left.
That's a retail price. Just that's me purely.
Retail. Okay.
Yeah.
But wholesale, let's say wholesale, they're wholesaling at around about $30 a kilo. I want to understand why there's such a massive.
Yeah. When you consider that the amount of staff that, if we go back to that amount of hands that it has to go through at a farm level, and then from an exporter to importer level, you know that thinking about it on a roasting level,
It's
you have
disproportionate,
many
Muki.
less. Yeah, where
Absolutely.
it's something I would want to understand better myself.
And that's why we have these conversations on the podcast, because we want to unpack where the disparity is so that we can start raising awareness of it. I'm uncomfortable with it. I'm uncomfortable with the fact that we've got a lot of roasters that are saying, I want to be really transparent with what I'm paying. And okay, I'm a fan of that. I really want to encourage it. I want to encourage, though, that we have a huge emphasis on quality of data and clarity of data. So it's one thing to turn around and say, I'm paying this much for my coffee. That's great. And I believe you. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt and believe you that that's the price that you're paying for your coffee. But it really, at the end of the day, tells me nothing. I need clarity in with that data. I need to understand how much you're paying the importer. I need to understand how much the importer is then paying the exporter and how much is being paid farm gate for that price. And when I have that understanding, then I'd love to know how many people work for you and why you're slapping an extra $10 so that the cafe has to pay. We're talking per kilo here.
Yeah.
$10, $20 per kilo. These are big numbers.
Yeah.
And I'm not averse to anybody making money. I own 2 businesses. I'm a big fan of capitalism, but I'm a bigger fan of conscious capitalism. I don't want us to be fucking anybody over just so that one person in particular or one part of the supply chain gets to survive the most. What they're not realizing is if they don't start paying attention to the supply chain, up the supply chain and down the supply chain, they're not going to have an agricultural product that they're going to be able to pass on.
I'm going to be transparent about this, but let's break it down a little bit.
Okay.
Let's say at a farm gate level, if you're purchasing a specialty grade coffee, price at the moment is probably going to be in the realm of $3 to $3.50 a pound. That's
what kind of origin? Is that like a generalization? On average?
Let me change that a little bit. That's not farm gate pricing. That is on FOB pricing. So that's on ship. Farm gate pricing, you're probably going to be paid, depending on the quality, per bag. And the reason for this is a lot of farmers will sell their coffee completely mixed with, that's everything. So they've processed the coffee. That's the best way of explaining this.
So let's give some more context though, some more specific context so that we can make this a standalone podcast. Can you explain farm gate and FOB and then give some specifics with some numbers?
Yeah. All right. So farm gate pricing is a price that the farmer will be offered when they approach a broker or an exporter. This
what?
Per bag, usually.
Which is usually about 60 kilos, right?
About 60 kilos, depending on the country. Sometimes this doesn't seem like much. Like it'll be, in Brazil, it could be anywhere between 800 to 1,000 reais if it's a really specialty coffee. And if I pull up just quickly...
and again, for anyone who's listening, specialty is considered 80 and above. And specialty, what Muki's talking about, and correct me if I'm wrong, Muki, you're talking about being traded direct as opposed to being traded on the C market. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. So if we look at about 1,000 reals a bag for a 60 kilo bag, that's looking around $262 divided by 60 kilos. You're being paid about you're paying, that's actually quite a lot, $4.30
per kilo.
Per kilo of coffee.
So $2.15 per pound, which is actually, compared to the C market right now, that's like double and more.
Yes. Yeah. So that's a specialty grade coffee. That I would say that's something that
what's that score?
I know we've paid. that's scoring around 87, 88.
So it's a good coffee.
Yeah, so this is a good coffee. But depending on the situation, that exporter might be purchasing that coffee at that price. That's with all the defects, all the screen sizes. So
that's a farm gate price. Is that correct?
Yeah. So let's say you're paying roughly around the $2 a pound mark.
Okay, farm gate.
Yeah, and that's for them to produce a really, really specialty coffee. That exporter then has to take that lot, sort it, clear out any defects if there are any, run it through all their QC, split it, cup it, everything, warehouse it, bag it, pack it, and by the time that you get to your boat, that suddenly becomes approximately $3.50.
And that's what we call the FOB price.
Yeah.
Freight on board, free on board, sorry.
Yeah. So then you're adding per pound cost is around $1.30. That you're paying for that exporter, all the warehousing, all that pre-check before it gets on board.
Insurance.
Yeah. And
security to make sure that it gets to the port.
And generally that free on board price is what the importer will pay to purchase that coffee.
The importer pays the exporter that amount. Now, when that happens, if you don't mind me asking for seeking some clarification there, how is that payment made? Do they make, so the exporter pays the farmer on the spot, the farm gate price?
Yes.
And then the importer pays they pay the exporter, but how do they go about paying them? Do they pay them on the spot? Do they wait until it's sold on the other end?
It's usually
live on the other end.
There are many different ways that this is done.
Okay.
A common one is cash against documents. So you don't pay until you receive your shipping documents, your contracts. But it's a very complicated process that involves many banks and many checks.
I've heard some horror stories. I really have. I've heard some horror stories where the agreement has been that they'll be paid as soon as it's on the ship. That's when everyone before that in the supply chain gets paid. Yeah. And then the coffee's already been sold in that's new country and no one's been paid.
Yeah. But that's where I think it's really important to have these people in the middle because these are the people that manage that risk. If you work with reputable,
if you're working with
good people, they're an asset to that supply chain. Everyone has their place. But so back on that, if we're selling, so the importer then receives that coffee, then had to pay for everyone from that process of on the ship to your warehouse and all your stuff in between, you might add 10% on that.
Ollie told me that, and he said it on the podcast, so it's okay for us to talk about it more, that because I'm assuming that 10% is made by people like Condesa and Econ, right? When you look at it that way, 10% is not a lot of money, but that's not the only revenue stream for companies like yours. You make money on playing with the currencies, right?
Yes.
And that's where the bulk of the money is necessarily made.
I'm not incredibly well versed in this.
But it is definitely a healthy part of the supply of the revenue streams.
Yeah. I think that's where...
I'm pretty sure it was Ollie that talked to me about that. Yeah.
Our company, Condesa, we're versatile in that way.
So we hedge. That again?
The company is very flexible and versatile in that way. So we hedge a lot of currency, and we're not completely reliant on that margin that we're making off coffee. Granted, it's a very integral part of the business.
Yeah, but it's smart business. If you can leverage what you're doing in other ways, why wouldn't you? It's just smart business. So, people say to me, Lee, you have too much compassion for the importers. Like, they're the ones who are fucking everybody over. I'm like, listen, I don't have.
Yeah.
Listen, it's not about that. I don't have compassion or sympathy or anything for any vested interest in any one part of the supply chain. I'm trying to understand this very complex system that's going on that seems to have smoke and mirrors so that you don't really know what's going on.
I put in this slide. How many of you, putting out to the audience here, how many of you genuinely know what the other does in the industry?
They don't.
Because you need to look at it in this holistic view, that it's not one person gaming the other. We're all necessary, but we all deserve to be making money.
Yeah. And
maybe not one more than the other. I think that definitely the farmer has the short end of the stick in this scenario.
I think both extremes of the coffee supply chain are getting the short end of the stick here, Muki, because honestly, the number of cafe owners that I know, even very competent ones, that are really struggling to keep the doors open, are not keeping the doors open because of the margins they're making on coffee. They're keeping the doors open because of the margins they're making on food and merch. It's not the coffee that's making them the money. And the farmers are getting fucked over the hardest out of all of it. My problem is that it's the roasters that are making the biggest noise about transparency and traceability reports and, we need to be making more money for the fucking farmer. Okay, but you're making the bulk of the money.
Yeah.
So what is it that I'm missing here? Why is it that
interesting.
The loudest fucking voices are coming from the people who are making most of the money?
Yeah.
I don't get it. And you look at people like Mark Dundon, and I refer to Mark a lot because he was ropeable when he was on this podcast. He was so angry because he cannot figure out how to fix this. And I empathize with him big time on this. He is paying big dollars to the farmers. He's paying more than what they ask for. It's a rule with him, right? His problem is, from his wholesale perspective, he can't get people to pay for wholesale coffee because they don't think that they could get it cheaper elsewhere. They can get coffee that they can fool their customers into believing is good quality coffee. It might score 5 points less, but their customers are going to order a cappuccino with 2 sugars anyway, so they'll give 0 fucks about it.
Yeah. It's crazy, the disparity of that. It's crazy that you still have people selling wholesale coffee at $20 or less a kilo.
It doesn't seem right. And because customers, the consumers at the very end of the supply chain are not educated on what the fuck's going on, they're unknowingly complicit in a lot of these practices that are going on, and perpetuating this supply chain nightmare.
Yep.
But you can't blame them because, a lot of people are doing it really tough right now. And so if they're doing it really tough and they can't afford to pay $6 a cup, and the $6 that they're going to pay for the cup isn't going to change really how the money's going to end up trickling down from the supply chain.
Yeah.
The roasters need to be prepared to support more direct relationships with farmers and pay better prices for the farmers, but not necessarily pass those costs on to the cafes. They can take a bigger hit, right?
I hope so.
But is my logic incorrect here? Or is there something more that I'm missing? I really feel like over the last year, I've been trying to piece this together. I don't have any of these answers. I'm really just trying to understand how it got so broken. And who really needs to be putting their hand up and saying, so listen, we could probably take a bigger hit here so that the back end and the front end of the very front end of the supply chain don't have to be doing it so tough.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think you could run a panel like that in the future. Get everyone in the same room.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I'm not accusing. And for anyone who's listening to this, go ahead and send me all the emails that you're going to send me anyway if you're going to be having a dig at me about this. But I'm not accusing anyone here. I'm trying to help us all understand how this system got so broken. But I also don't want to. I believe that there are some players in this game that are trying to get us to look over here when we should actually be looking over here.
Yep. I think there's definitely a lot of honest conversation to be had.
Why do you think people don't want to have it? Money?
I think so. You're losing your advantage, right? So
this brings me back to this competition thing that seems to be a thread that keeps going through this podcast every now and then. It's this idea of this. I'm trying to get my head around this idea of competition because I'm not a competitive person. And I believe that competition is fantastic. I just personally am not a competitive person. And I need to get better at doing that. I don't understand the behavior because I feel that the more competitive you are, the more willing you have to be to say, I will win at all costs.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of that going on in our industry. And that's what I think needs to be dialed back. This winning at all costs is going to eventuate into you actually being the recipient of those costs when you can't have access to the shitty coffees that you're buying because they now cost what the older coffees used to cost, the more expensive coffees used to cost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We have to get more responsible.
Yeah.
Or am I reading this situation wrong?
No, I think there's a lot of change to be had.
So do you agree?
Coffee is still such a young industry, and there's still such a long way to go in many aspects. But there's a lot of things that needs to be changed. At the same time, a lot of things that we do in coffee are things that we've done forever, and it makes no sense why we shouldn't change. That makes sense?
Very much so. Especially because if we look at it, and I spoke about this on in the Daily Coffee Pro a couple of episodes ago. Coffee houses have existed since the 1600s. That's when they started becoming popular. We've had a number of centuries to get this shit right.
Yeah.
We should be ashamed of ourselves that we're only just starting to ask these questions now.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I'm grateful for things like the internet and social media and whatnot that allow a greater voice for the people at the back end of the supply chain to start vocalizing what they do, to start being a part of the conversation, and for us to start probing about what's broken about this. I want this industry to survive. I love being a part of this industry. And it's not some woo-woo shit where we're saying like, you know, we may collapse as an industry if we don't start looking after this.
Yeah.
At the very least, what we can expect to happen is that coffee becomes a very expensive commodity. If farmers decide, fuck you, we're not going to do this anymore, it makes no sense for us, this is going to become a luxury item.
Yeah.
And I don't want to see that happen.
No. I never wanted to get to the point where I can't have a coffee every day.
I say that as I'm drinking some elixir, And I've been asked the question by a lot of people, if this is such a big problem, what's going to happen to Elixir? Because we buy expensive coffees. I, as the ship steerer of this company, made a very clear decision somewhere around about 8 months ago, after I started to uncover all of this for myself through this podcast. I started to look at the coffees that we were buying, and we started conversations around how do we not become complicit in this? And so what we do is we have longer conversations with the roasters that we work with to find out what they know about how this coffee was sourced, how much the people are being paid farm gate, and I want to get a better understanding of that. So because of that, we tend to buy more expensive coffees by a long shot. And, I get asked all the time, why is Elixir so expensive? Why is it $8 a bottle? Well, that's why it's $8 a bottle. It's expensive packaging, and we pay big prices.
Why can't it be $8 a bottle?
Exactly. There's nothing else on the market. People's main problem with the fact that it's $8 a bottle is it's delicious and they want to be able to drink it every day. And at $8 a bottle, they can't afford to do that. And I'm okay with that, because for the people who are able to pay $8 a bottle, I know that none of us have to put up with this feeling inside of us that I am supporting slavery or sex trafficking or any kind of horrible practices that are going on coffee farms. I'm doing the best that I can to raise awareness to the 10,000 people who are on my Instagram for Elixir and talk to them about why Elixir is so expensive and how they can drink it confidently, knowing that they are not complicit in these horrible practices. And they feel good about it. And I feel good about it as the person who is running a company whose number one currency is peace of mind. That is every single decision we make in both Map It Forward and Elixir, we trade in one major currency, and that's peace of mind. So every business decision we make has to put a deposit into the peace of mind bank. And that's the way that we approach it. And a big chunk of that started to get drained the more I learnt about how our coffee buying practices, thinking that I was paying good money for coffee, I wasn't complicit in any of this, but because I wasn't asking the questions of the roasters, I was complicit by association in these practices. And so once I had uncovered this through the podcast and starting to understand what was going on at the farms and these horribly low farm gate numbers that were being paid, I started realizing that I've lost a lot of my peace of mind around this. I couldn't sleep. And the conversations that we can have. So, we've got a big project that we're about to announce around SCA, and we're going to be ordering big bulks of coffee coming into the next 12 months. And the conversations that we're going to be having around that are primarily about how much is the farmer getting paid from the amount that we're getting paid. I understand that everyone needs to make money, but if the farmer had to sell this coffee at a lower price than what it cost them to produce, I cannot be part of that. I don't want to be a part of that. And I know that happens far too often, because I've had people on this podcast who are telling me that they have had to do that. And then every bottle of Elixir is going to taste shit, no matter how good it tastes, if I have to drink Elixir that I know that's what's happened. But that's because I have the luxury of having this podcast and being able to, I get the privilege that's involved in that. I can have these conversations and I can understand it. But now I feel a sense of duty to help facilitate that message and that understanding getting out there into the general public so that they can actually understand the role that they're playing in perhaps the future demise of the coffee industry.
Well, this is going to go off on a very slight tangent, but you know how right now there seems to be a bit of a race in terms of innovation in coffee processing, and everyone's after. It's not just varietals anymore. It's not just about geisha
It's all the
anymore, but it's
different
about
kinds
like
of
fermentation with yeast, or like crazy new styles of drying, or different kinds of naturals, carbonic maceration, etc., etc. And everyone's after these kinds of coffees, right? And you have people saying, "Yeah, I'll pay more for these coffees. We're valuing them higher." But what a lot of people don't see is, so who pays for that innovation exactly?
right.
Like, being at Origin, I had a lot of people come and visit from overseas, and they would go visit a farm and say, "Hey, you should put in a drying bed. You should put in an African bed, put in a raised bed, or you guys should try this kind of fermentation," without understanding who pays for that.
So are they assuming when they go to Origin that if they say, well, is the farmer assuming that if some white guy comes to my farm and tells me I should put in a drying bed, and I put in that drying bed, they're going to be more likely to buy it. So of course I should go ahead and do it.
Yeah. But I hate that. You shouldn't be. You should be more likely to buy it. If you're asking the farmer to do it, you should buy it. It's a mix of things. If you're asking the farmer to do something, you should be buying it, whether it's good or bad. Or you should be investing in that technology at Origin for them. So if you want them to do raised bed coffee, pay for their fucking raised bed.
Yeah.
Or if you want them to do interesting fermentation, pay for a consultant to visit them. Like, these are all long-term changes that can, like, ultimately coffee is valued at its quality.
If anybody would like a model to follow with this, I know I talk about him a lot, but it's because of this, and he deserves to be spoken about a lot. Please speak to Christopher Ferran. So Christopher Ferran from Phoenix Coffee, he's the director of coffee at Phoenix Coffee. Excuse me. And he's been on the podcast twice. Muki, you'll love this. So when he works with a producer,
I've spoken with Chris. I know Chris.
Isn't he? He's awesome. The thing about Chris is he speaks, when he creates a long-term contract with a producer, he says to them, this is the price I'm going to pay you for your crop. If you invest in innovation, this is the price I'm going to pay you for the crop. If you employ an agronomist, I'm going to pay you even more. If you're going to get Lucia out there and do fermentation, I'll pay you even more. So he is incentivizing them and reimbursing them the cost, sometimes more than what it would take for them to invest in themselves. And so what happens is, let's say he goes ahead and says, if you do get Lucia out there, I'm going to absolutely cover the costs of that. Lucia's going out there and educating these people in improving their farming practices and their processing practices, so that it's not just Christopher's crops that they're going to benefit from with that.
It's a long-term benefit.
It's a long-term benefit across the board. And Christopher's funded that.
Yeah.
Because he's the direct recipient of the quality that's going to come from that.
Yeah. Like, if we look at quality as the point where they can get that increased return.
Say that again, Muki. If we look at quality where they get the increased return.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the better the quality, the better the return. If we look at purely that, it makes sense to invest in that. Just invest in quality.
Only if you're going to be able to pass that on to up the supply chain.
Yes.
Right? So
yes, but if we look at it that way, and I know you were speaking before on how do we make sure that increased price is passed back down to the farmer? Maybe it's not about paying that FOB price, that flat price. Maybe it's about investing directly with the farmer, investing in that relationship, investing in their farm. because that way, you know, and we have a couple of people who do it with some of the projects we work with in Brazil. They pay, rather than paying a huge increased cost, right? Like, let's say they're purchasing their coffee for $3 FOB. Instead of paying $4 or $5 FOB, they're paying $3, but they're also spending money on their quality lab, or they're purchasing the installation of 3 raised beds.
Yeah, you know who's a big fan of this? Go ahead, sorry.
But you know that money is going to that community, right, that farmer. It's direct, and it's a long-term investment on their quality.
Yeah. Cosimo Lobato, shout out to Cosimo.
Yes.
He has changed jobs now. He's working for Caramali in Italy, but he was previously the CEO of Toby's Estate. He's one of the early guests on this podcast and spoke at length about the initiatives that he was working with his grain buyer, Charlotte, to make happen at Origin, so that not just the farms were better off and the technology on these farms were better off. He was very interested in ensuring that the quality of the lives of the employees on the farm benefited from Toby's Estate doing business with those farms.
Yep.
So what he would do is pay for things like medical centers and preschools, and they would fund those things, and they would make sure that they give them they would first find out what they needed, and then Toby's Estate would, instead of paying more for the coffee, they would go and pay for those amenities.
Yep. I'm going to bring up an ugly S word that I think a lot of specialty people don't like. But you know who does that really well?
Who?
Starbucks.
Well, they really do.
They really do. In many communities, if someone had the option to sell to Starbucks or to a specialty roaster, they sell it to Starbucks, because Starbucks, if they like your coffee, they will buy it year in, year out, and they will invest. The way that they invest in coffee and in communities, I don't see it being done by many specialty roasters.
And Muki, it's not just on that end of the supply chain. Employees of Starbucks, and they'll be the first to tell you it's not perfect, but let me tell you, employees of Starbucks get free college. Starbucks will pay for your college tuition. They will they pay for your health benefits, which is fucking expensive in this country. You're looking at a few $100s a month just for health insurance.
Yeah. It's just insane.
It's insane. And so Starbucks have figured out that if we look after our people, we have longevity as a business. There's a reason Schultz is running for president. And I don't know that it's a fucking terrible thing that he's going to do it either, because the man's figured out how to keep people happy.
If you look at it in that light, right, a lot of people look at a lot of these big businesses, if we just purely focus on Starbucks, it makes no sense for them to run out of coffee.
It makes no sense that they will run out of coffee, or that they should run out of coffee.
That they are working against the sustainability of coffee. If their business is to sell coffee.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
They've figured out that they're going to cut their nose off to spite their face if they fuck the supply chain over.
Yeah. So the way that I see them invest in their purchasing, in the communities that they work with, it's pretty noble in many aspects. And I wish I saw more of it genuinely come from a lot of these smaller roasters. I think there's always more you can do.
I think that this is a line that we're going to have to push with more roasters.
Like you see, we talk about these transparency reports, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean? That you pay, it's almost like a race to see, who's paying more for coffee. But what does that mean really?
This is my problem with these transparency reports is I want clarity behind it.
Yeah. I would rather have that person say, look, I'm only paying $3 a pound for my coffee, but I also spent $10,000 on their community center and their quality lab, and we dropped $5,000 for an agronomist to visit during this crop for X and X. Like that for me, I see more benefit than someone saying, I paid $4 a pound and don't know about anything else.
Yeah. It's a duty of care. This is a phrase that I'm talking about more and more with the workshops that we do in Map It Forward and on the podcasts, both of them. We have a duty of care in conspiring to each other's success. The duty of care we have is to everybody along the supply chain, because if we don't, we're fucking ourselves over, no matter where we sit on the supply chain. If we don't start paying fair prices for these farms and supporting their long-term viability of their businesses, we're not going to have an industry. No matter how well we fix this problem with growing coffee trees, if we cannot pay them and support a sustainable business model, we're not going to survive as a specialty industry.
No.
Because Nestle has locked down their contracts and they're always going to survive.
Yeah.
The volumes that they buy at, they're not going to get hurt by this. Starbucks takes care of its farmers. They're not going to be hurt by this.
Yeah. That's interesting bring up. So Indonesia is an interesting example where Starbucks buys a lot of Indonesian coffee, and the crop in this past year seems to have quite heavily reduced. It's really difficult to source, especially it's really, really expensive.
And for anyone listening, just in case you haven't heard it before, Starbucks only buys specialty grade.
They do.
They only buy specialty grade. So it's not like Nestle. Nestle's going out there and buying whatever. Starbucks are not. Starbucks are only buying 80 and above.
Yeah.
Just so that you understand that.
I've never worked at Starbucks. I don't even drink their coffee actually.
Neither
but I do have massive respect for them. They're definitely not perfect, but they do some good out there, and I wish people saw it more in that light.
Yeah, we've had somebody from Starbucks Reserve on the podcast, Jimmy Canali, and we're going to have more people from Starbucks. I'm hoping to have people from a bunch of different little holes and cubbies in the coffee industry to come on and start presenting a more even picture of exactly what's going on. And having a conversation with me I'm not going to let people get away with shit. You can tell me that all you do is pay fair prices for everything. Well, I don't know how you do that. If you're creating, if you're buying coffee at $1 a pound.
Yes.
I don't understand how that's the case, and I want to understand it. I'm all ears to hear how you think that that's a fair model.
Yeah.
And how you think that a farmer's going to be able to survive on that. If you can convince me, good luck. I'm open to being convinced, but I'm not someone who believes people for just because they've said it.
Yeah.
There's so much more we could talk about, Muki, so you're going to have to come back.
I'd love to. I think I'm looking at the list I had up, and there's a bunch of things that we haven't even touched on.
Oh yeah, but
yeah,
you're not going anywhere, and I'm not going anywhere, and we've got many, many, many more years of this podcast to come. And I'd love you to come back and have I'd say a longer chat, but we've been going for 2 hours already. So I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's been really great. You've helped me understand a lot that I didn't understand before, so I appreciate that. And I really appreciate what you're doing for the industry, because you have a genuinely your intention is genuinely placed with what you want to do for the industry, Muki, and I appreciate that.
Thank you. I love the coffee industry. It's there are times, particularly in Brazil, where I would be there and I'll pinch myself that I couldn't believe that it was happening. It's just built up some of the most wonderful, passionate, interesting people. And I know if there's any way that I could make it better, I would. I think that's what I work towards.
And that's what I love about you, Muki. You are not here to you're not here to be Insta famous.
No, I like to think
so many people in the industry are like, how do I get my tattoos on Instagram? My Rosetta tattoos, or my what do they call it? A deconstructed portafilter handle tattoo on Instagram. No, you just want to.
I like to think of it as I just quietly chug away in that corner and I just keep going.
Well, I hope we amplified that quietness a little bit today.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for coming on, Muki. I really appreciate it.
No, thanks, Lee.
Have an amazing day.
Will do. Thanks.
See you later.